Hello, this is a video about effective aperture and why it's important for macros. Now we all know about aperture. That's the size of the hole through which the light comes, and its importance for macro is that if you use a small aperture, the depth of field, which we want lots of for macro, will be larger, but the smaller the aperture you use, although the depth of field will be larger, what's in focus from front to back, what's in focus will be less sharp than it would be if you used a larger aperture and put up with narrower depth of field. The other thing is that if you use a small aperture, you're not getting much light into the camera, so if you're using natural light, you have to use a slower shutter speed if you close the aperture down to a smaller amount, or you have to increase the ISO so the camera makes more of the light that it's getting. If you're using flash, if you reduce the aperture, you have to increase the power of the flash or increase the ISO. The problem is with macro that what the camera tells you you're using by way of the aperture isn't the actual aperture that you're using, or the effective aperture. The effective aperture is smaller than the than the aperture that the camera tells you you're using. And the larger the magnification is, the bigger the difference is between the aperture that the camera tells you you're using and the aperture that you're actually using. Now I think I can demonstrate this. I'm going to start by using natural light, so the flash unit isn't on at the moment, and on this camera I've got a lens reversed and some extension tubes behind it, which is going to give us plenty of magnification. And if I move this, and there we go. So we're now looking at a scene which is about, and it doesn't matter whether it's completely in focus or not for this exercise, it's about 10 millimeters across. If I go across there, that will be easier to see. It's about 10 millimeters across. And the camera, if I put the ISO on, say 800, the aperture is f11. I've set this lens to f11, and the camera is telling me that I need, if I put it in AV mode, it's telling me that I need a 15th of a second to take the image, capture the image. If I now change the magnification and move the camera in, we're now looking at a scene which is about 3 millimeters wide. A bit difficult to hold it steady. And it's saying that we now want a 1/4 of a second rather than a 15th. Now I haven't changed the aperture, I haven't changed the ISO. It's telling me what the shutter speed should be, and it's telling me that there should be a much slower shutter speed, and that's because the magnification's increased. Let me try doing a similar thing now with the flash. I'll turn the flash on and put it into manual mode, the camera. Also, the flash is a manual flash, so I get to decide how powerful the flashlight is. So I'm going to come back to, here we are, we're looking at 10 millimeters. Now we're going to have to experiment a bit here. That's overexposed, so I'll turn this down, let's say by 3 stops, that's quite a lot, and see where we get to. It's now telling me it's okay. In fact, you can see from the histogram that that's quite nicely exposed. So that's using, we're on ISO 800 and f11, and it's using, full power is at the right, and it goes down to 128, so it's using 1/64th of the available flash power. If I now change the magnification, so we go back to that scene which was 3 millimeters across, and there we go, and I take the scene, it's now, we can see from the histogram, underexposed by a fair amount. So if I turn it up by a couple of stops, take the picture again, and again it's exposed okay now, we can see that from the histogram. So I've had to use 2 stops more flash power because I've increased the magnification. Now, at the moment, I'm changing from one magnification to another, and not a huge amount of difference in magnification, significant, but you may be having much larger differences in magnifications. So these differences in the amount of light you have to throw at the scene if you're using flash, or the shutter speeds, or the increases in ISO that you have to use, can get to be pretty big. There's a formula for this, which is that the effective aperture, the one you're actually using, is the aperture that the camera tells you, or that you've set on the camera, multiplied by 1 plus the magnification. So, if you're using a magnification of 1, or 1:1 magnification, then the effective aperture is 1 plus the magnification, which is 1 plus 1, times the aperture you're using. In this case, it's f11. So that's 1 plus 1, 2 times f11. Even though we've set the camera to f11, we're actually using f22. And the impact on the image in terms of the depth of field and the degree of softness, lack of detail in the image caused by diffraction, will be the same as it is what you get at f22. Suppose now that we are at 3 times magnification, 3:1. Then the effective aperture is 1 plus 3, which is 4, times our f11, which is about 44, which is about f45. And if we are operating at 5:1, which you can with an MP65, which you can, I'm beyond 5:1 here, then it's 1 plus 5, which is 6, times 11, which is 66. And again, if you were operating at 10 times magnification, it would be 11 times 11, which is f121. Now, bear in mind that the smaller the aperture gets, the less sharp, less detailed the image is. So you may have relatively large amounts of depth of field, but you may not have anything worth looking at within that area that's a bit in focus. So you may want to reduce the aperture that you're setting on the camera when you're using higher magnifications. For example, suppose we were operating at 5:1 magnification. If we set the camera to f4, then the effective aperture would be, because we're operating at 5:1, would be 1 plus 5, which is 6, times 4, which is 24, which might be a reasonable aperture to use. Some people think that's too much, too small, but certainly one that I use. You might even want to go down, if you're using an MP65 and something that goes down this far, you might want to use f2.8. And at 5:1, that is 6 times 2.8, which is 3 times 5.6, which is about f16. So that's what effective aperture is. It's the real aperture that you're using when you're taking macros at a high magnification. The effect is more marked as the magnification increases, and by the same token it's less marked as the magnification goes in the opposite direction from 1:1. So if you're doing what I think of as a close-up, then, for example, if you're working at 1:2, then the magnification is a half, and the effective aperture is 1 plus a half, times, in this case, f11, which would be 11 plus 5.6, which is about f16. And if you go to lower magnifications, like 1:4, for example, it hardly makes any difference at all. So you really need to be aware of this when you're doing higher magnification work, and you need to throttle back on the aperture, as it were, open up the aperture in order to avoid using effective apertures which are going to give you very soft images indeed. So that's it. Effective aperture. That's all for now. Goodbye.